Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third and final webinar session dedicated to the UK local government and healthcare sector. Thank you for taking time out and being here today. It is my pleasure to welcome Rob Buff, our Knowledge and Information Management Practice Lead, here today as your host to talk about how to manage public records in Microsoft 365. We will be running a live Q&A at the end of the webinar, so during the session you can submit your questions in the questions tab and Rob will cover them at the end of his presentation. In case we don't have enough time to cover all the questions, there will be a follow-up blog post where those will get covered. The recording of this session will be available on our website and YouTube channel once processed. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Rob. Welcome, everybody.
Hi everyone, I'll just turn my camera on. Hopefully you can all see my slides, because I can't.
Yes, we can.
Which is always fun. So I'm going to be doing this slightly blindfold, simply because I can't actually see my slides at the moment for a lovely TV issue here at this end. But anyway, I don't think it should affect us too much. You can just laugh when it goes slightly wrong. So, just like to introduce myself. I'm sure some of you know me already. I'm sure some of you have no idea who I am. So my name's Rob Barth. I'm a Microsoft 365 solution architect. And I'm also the digital director for the Information and Records Management Society. So while I've come from that technical basis, while I've come from the Microsoft 365 side, I'm very much focused on the information and records management space. I've worked with various people who are on this call today in different sectors to help build records management solutions into Microsoft 365. Now, effectively, as you can probably imagine, what I'm trying to do is almost span the bridge, close the gap, I guess, between the knowledge that the technical specialists have around Microsoft 365 and what the platform provides, and specifically what records managers want to achieve inside the platform. Now, as you can probably tell, I'm employed by a company called Intelogy. Intelogy are based just south of Heathrow Airport, actually, just on the outskirts of London. We're a Microsoft 365 Gold partner, and we provide the whole breadth of services across Microsoft 365. So, let's dive in. What I want to do in today's session is look at some of the, I guess, provide an overview of the retention capabilities that are provided within Microsoft 365, and specifically look at how they might be useful to the local government sector. I want to look at some of the more recent capabilities. Specifically, I'm thinking that it will be useful to dive in and take a closer look at adaptive scopes, which frankly are hot off the press. They've only come out in the last few weeks. And I also want to look at, just assess the model of how you apply retention at a high level to the structures inside Microsoft 365. And of course, as Margarita kindly mentioned, any questions, I'll try my best to answer any questions you happen to have. Any, feel free to use I hope you can all see the questions section inside GoToWebinar, and also the chat section. Feel free to use them liberally, and I'll try and answer any questions you've got towards the end of the session. And don't hesitate to get in contact, by the way. Always happy to try and help. So, I don't need to teach most of you, because I'm assuming that many of the people on this call are from the information and records management space and probably very heavily invested in the public sector as well. So I don't need to teach you all the relevant legislation. That said, I think it's probably really useful if we just look at it and have a little overview of almost your obligations in this area. So under the 1962 Local Government Records Act, it's an interesting one, this, because it almost empowered you to do records management, but didn't insist upon it. It wasn't a necessity. So almost the word may there in that first part of the quote is quite an interesting one, because it gives it empowers you to do an awful lot. Do anything you need to protect those records, but you don't have to. That's my interpretation anyway. I'm not a legal expert. But I think this got tightened up quite a bit 10 years later with the introduction of the Local Governments Act 1972. I say tightened up because obviously this gives you an obligation to make whatever proper arrangements are for managing all of the documents that, both the documents that you have as an organization, but also those that I guess are in your custody as well, those that are brought in and owned by other organizations. Now, helpfully, proper arrangements was tightened up in terms of its meeting. So the department, I don't believe it exists anymore, Department of Environment, Transport and the Regions, basically helped in 1999 to provide additional guidance on what was really meant by proper arrangements. And they started mentioning the preservation of records. So you are required to undertake the preservation of records, including, as you can see in the quote, storage and conservation. And importantly, also, they mentioned in that guidance that it was cross-medium. So it's not just limited to paper-based records and paper-based documentation. One of the important types of records that were identified in the Local Government Act, or should I say in the clarification in 1999, was electronic content. So I think the Local Government Act, for many of you working in local authorities, really places an obligation and onus on managing your records that are electronic records well. Now, there's a whole bunch of other acts. Obviously, those of you in Wales will be more familiar with the Welsh equivalent in 1994. But certainly the Data Protection Act and the Freedom of Information Act go across everyone's, all local authorities. And while they don't dictate that you manage things as records, and manage your content as records, really, to be able to comply with those acts, I think having a good records management background and having most of your content well managed and well structured really is going to help you abide by those acts much more easily and much more effectively as an organization, helping to reduce your risk significantly. Now, I don't want to dwell on the legislation. Don't worry, this is the last bit of slide that I'm going to talk about legislation on. But I just wanted to, I guess, mention that we're doing this in the changing landscape. So the last few years have seen significant change across many local authorities, not all, but what we've seen is a significant jump into Microsoft 365. It's certainly not used by every local authority across the UK, but it's now become almost the platform of choice for the vast majority of organisations in local government in the UK. Wish I had some stats to hand, but if I was to take a guess, I would suggest that at least 70%, maybe 80% of local authorities in the UK have now moved to Microsoft 365. And the others, the remaining 20, 30% are really split across multiple different document and information management solutions, from file shares, things like Objective, Document, and Google, for example. So each of them commands, quite a small percentage chunk by themselves, but each of them provides adequate solutions. But almost this is probably the first time since FileShare, I guess, where we've seen the majority of local government authorities in a single sort of stack. So that makes the records management and retention capabilities inside Microsoft 365, I think, really fundamental to most local authorities across the UK. And I don't know, I certainly know of some local authorities that use them very effectively. I don't know how consistent that is across all areas of local government in the UK. So let's take a closer look at what we're actually talking about when we're talking about those retention capabilities. So I don't need to teach you what records management is, but at a very high level, my bad analogy here is it's sorting the wheat from the chaff. So effectively what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure that the information that you absolutely need to retain as an organization is kept and it cannot be deleted. And that at the same time, the lower value content that you really shouldn't, or in some cases mustn't, especially with GDPR, mustn't be retaining as an organization, is deleted on a timely basis. So really the retention capabilities that Microsoft 365 brings to the table are probably your best friends and worst enemies in some cases, but the tools you will be relying on to make sure that your content across the board is being well retained and well managed. So you've probably heard, many of you will be very familiar with these, but at a high level, you've got two primary capabilities provided by Microsoft. And different authorities are in different places and will choose a different combination of these two capabilities. What you've got is the retention policy and the retention label. Heard another speaker once refer to these as the gruesome twosome, which made me chuckle. But Effectively, retention policies and retention labels are the backbone of retention in Microsoft 365. So let's take a closer look at precisely what they do. So starting off with the retention policy. Now, retention policy is probably best described, I think, as the broad brush approach to retention. I'd see some organizations, specifically those who tend to have lower needs when it comes to information compliance, or those who, I guess, almost want to keep it simple. Certainly if, for example, you're constrained by licenses, the retention policy might well be the best and most appropriate approach for you. Now, what you're really looking at is a very broad brush, one-size-fits-all approach to retention, because you get to define a whole bunch of rules. Effectively, these retention policies are probably best described as rules, where different types of content can be retained for different durations, and at the end of their retention, there's a simple flat choice between automatically deleting content when it reaches the end of the retention period, or choosing to do nothing, which doing nothing is always a bit of an odd one, but effectively what it means is that from a user perspective, if a user hits delete on a file during that retention period, the retention policy will catch that item and store it in a hidden container behind the scenes, whether we're talking about an email or whether we're talking about a file in SharePoint. Really doesn't, it catches the content and will store it behind the scenes for the remainder of the retention period. And at the end of that retention period, because the user has chosen to do nothing, effectively it will, but because the user is also, because the retention policy is set to do nothing, but because the user has chosen to hit delete, effectively the end of that retention period, that item will be automatically deleted down. But if during retention the user no user clicks delete, do nothing will effectively mean that after the end of the retention, the file will continue to be preserved inside the location where it was, the inbox or the document library, let's say, and nothing will happen. And that means that following the end of retention, any user can click delete and that particular item will indeed be deleted and not caught by the retention policy. So it does do a little bit more than nothing. And the way this works with retention policies is you're almost either applying the retention policy across, say, a very wide scope, like everything that's in everyone's OneDrive or every single SharePoint site, in which case all content that happens to be in that particular area is subject to the same retention. But you can, with retention policies, pick to apply it at almost a building block layer. So you can see here, for example, I've applied it to the whole of the Roman team, the financial label retention policy, or I've applied the unclassified comms retention policy to the whole of Ben Meyer's OneDrive. What you can't do with the retention policy is you can't apply it to individual items. It's a one-size-fits-all approach. So you pick the whole of an area and say everything in this area is subject to the same retention. So to give you a flavor, Lara here, her Exchange mailbox. Lara's Exchange mailbox will have the same financial destroy after 7 years retention policy applied to all of her emails. That means whether the email is related to the Christmas party or whether it actually is a major policy decision that's just been made, effectively the same retention will get applied to all of that content that happens to be in the same space. Now, it's a viable approach. It's obviously weak in some regards because you can't single out different items and choose to apply different retention to them. But it's actually quite flexible in terms of its ability to make it easy to apply across the tenancy. And certainly, I've heard it's gaining popularity in some areas. So, for example, I was speaking to some people in the Dutch government recently, and apparently retention policies are almost picking up traction across Holland, over and above retention labels. But personally, I think retention labels are probably the better vehicle to use. So let's have a quick look at those. So retention labels, for those of you not familiar with them, effectively allow much more granular classification of content. You can again set up a whole bunch of labels, but typically you'll set up more retention labels than you'd ever set up retention policies. I wouldn't say you'd want to reflect an entire file plan of retention labels, but you could certainly set up quite a lot of classifications to apply to different files across different parts of the tenancy. Each of those labels, you've got exactly the same, the ability to set up a retention duration and also an activity at the end of retention. But notice that alongside the ability to destroy content, you've also got with the retention policy, and also notice the ability to do nothing, which you also got the retention policy. Retention labels, if you happen to be licensed, and we'll come on to this in more detail in a second, if you happen to have a premium license, you've also got the ability to invoke a review at the end of retention with a retention label. So having disposition review capabilities is something that only retention labels have and not retention policies in Microsoft 365. And what you do with the retention labels is effectively they're grouped together. I wish Microsoft would have a different naming convention here, but effectively what you've got is a construct called a label policy. Now, the label policy allows you to group together retention labels, and what you do is you associate the label policy with a specific part of your tenancy. So in this case, you can see that we've associated different groupings of retention labels into different label policies, and then associated those label policies with specific sites. So to zoom in a little bit more detail, take this Office refurb site here, just a standalone SharePoint site. It's only got the two retention labels that are associated with the label policy that have been available to staff in that site. So from a user perspective, you see the labels. You actually see them as metadata that you can apply to the content inside this Office refurb site now. The other retention labels that are available in other parts of the tenancy are not available here in this Office refurb site. And I guess this almost highlights one of the differences between retention labels and retention policies, because retention labels are visible to the end user. There's something that every member of staff who has access to that particular part of the tenant will be able to see, and if they've got the ability to modify that file, they've also got the ability to modify the retention label. Whereas retention policies that we looked at before are almost hidden from the end user. They're in the background, they're defined centrally, and users often don't realize they even exist. So quickly run you through some of the sort of differences between the two constructs of retention policies and retention labels. So how do you apply them? Well, as we've seen with retention policies, it's that broad brush application. You're picking, say, the whole of everyone's OneDrives, or each individual user's OneDrive, or SharePoint site, or whatever part, whichever workload we're talking about in Microsoft 365. You're applying it almost at a high level, site by site, team by team type level. And all of the content inside that space is subject to the same retention. With retention labels, however, you've got different options. So obviously, the simplest and probably the worst approach is to rely on manual classification. Let's face it, I've never come across users who are enthusiastic for tagging their content manually. But that said, having the ability to manually change and pick out an individual item and say, actually, this is different than its peers and it needs to be subject to different retention. Let's say you notice an individual file contains, I don't know, someone's personal address that you shouldn't be preserving. Manual labeling gives you the ability to override any other retention that's applied. Now, the second bullet point down there, default values. This is by far my preferred approach in most scenarios, because effectively, if you can set default values for retention labels across most of your locations, I'm talking on your libraries, I'm talking on your folders, maybe even on your channels in Teams, you could effectively mean that all content that is put into that location will be automatically classified with the selected retention label. And then you could also override that manually with the manual labeling option if you wish to. Finally, there's various different automatic ways of applying retention labels in Microsoft 365. So you've got the ability to match phrases, for example. What I'm talking about here is really to scan across all of your content, emails, documents, etc., and apply retention labels where a specific keyword phrase occurs inside the actual content itself. You can also combine this with for example, where the SharePoint metadata is applied. So you could say where the content has been tagged with SharePoint metadata as with a specific term, let's say it's been tagged as being blue for whatever reason, and a specific keyword phrase exists inside the content. In that scenario, then you apply the retention label. You've got a bit of flexibility with that approach to automatic tagging. But it's worth remembering that's almost best for the exceptions rather than for the majority of your content. You've also got a concept called sensitive information types. A sensitive information type is probably best explained as almost a repeated pattern of a specific code or phrase. So think of it as a credit card number or a passport number. And all of your content that you scan that happens to contain that particular, something that's identified as, say, a French national security number, you can then apply a specific retention label to it. The third approach to automatic application of retention labels is a concept called a trainable classifier. A trainable classifier is effectively machine learning. You give a lot of positive types of a file examples. So you're talking 50 plus examples of a type of content, and you get the machine learning to learn what that content looks like. And the idea is that it's very good in scenarios where you've got a lot of very similar types of content. So let's say if you've got a vast array of policies, you could use trainable classifiers to automatically classify all of the policies, let's say, that happen to, if they've got a consistent format and work in a similar way to each other. There's also a fourth approach, I guess, to automatically applying retention labels, and that's through use of SharePoint syntax. Now, SharePoint syntax requires a completely separate license than the standards E3, E5, etc. licenses. But for those of you who have made use of SharePoint syntax or have looked at SharePoint syntax, effectively, SharePoint syntax provides two different models, really, but it's got models for automatically scanning and retrieving metadata from within the body of the content. So the idea is really it's very good for, say, processing forms and automatically extracting metadata from those forms, and you can use it to automatically apply a retention label. Again, it's best at fairly consistent types of content. Now, triggering the start of the retention period is also something that separates the retention policy from the retention label, because retention policies are triggered, they begin retention, you've got two choices: when the file was first created or when the file was last modified. And that goes irrespective of the type of file. I'm using file probably the wrong term, but when the record was first created or when the record was last modified, whether it's an email, whether it's a message. That's how the retention policy works. So it's all date driven. Whereas with retention labels, you've got significantly more flexibility. You've got both of those same options, but you've also got two others. So when an item was labeled, at the date someone's chosen to apply a label, you can trigger the start of retention from that event. This could be particularly useful, for example, if you happen to be moving content from one location where it wasn't labeled into another where it receives a label at a later point in its life cycle. I've also used it to great effect to allow content to be superseded. So you can almost apply a permanent retention label on a file and then change it to when the file is superseded, to allow a second retention label to be manually applied, but that triggers at the point that it's labeled, so it triggers immediately as soon as it's superseded. And finally, by far the most powerful in my mind application of retention labels is trigger for the start of retention is based on an event. So event-based retention is a whole big subject by itself, but effectively what it allows you to do is you can trigger different types of events that happens inside your organization. Whether we're talking about the end of the financial year and you want to close down, invoke the start of retention for all files that need to be closed at the end of the financial year. Or whether we're talking about, for example, a project closing and you want to trigger the start of retention based on that project close. Event-based retention gives you that capability, so you can actually trigger retention to start en masse when you need it. To achieve this, what you need is, in addition to the retention label, you also need to tag all of your content with an additional ID. So, for example, a project reference number. And that way, you almost can start, triggering the start of retention for all of the content that's being tagged with the retention label within a given project or within a given financial year, for example. Now, during retention, content that's subject to a retention policy can continue to be changed. There is no concept of immutability with retention policies. okay? But content that users delete is caught and held behind the scenes. With retention labels, it's very similar, albeit you've got an extra concept inside retention labels of something that Microsoft called the record label. There's actually various variants of retention label. There's a record label, there's a regulatory record label for severe immutability. You can never unlock the regulatory record label. But effectively, you've got the ability to make files and content and email unmodifiable, immutable. And you've got that flexibility with retention labels that you don't have with the retention policy. Notice here for retention labels, also, when a file, content that has a retention label applied to it is deleted, it is also caught behind the scenes. Now, some of you who know retention labels well might well be furrowing your eyebrows at that statement, because had I been running this presentation only 6 weeks ago or so, I would have said something very different there. And that's because for the last 5 years, since retention labels first were provided in the tenancy, when a user hit delete on a file that was subject to a retention label, an error message would appear at the top of the screen saying, sorry, you can't delete this. It's subject to a retention label. You have to remove the retention label first. And various organizations trained users when they legitimately wanted to delete an item, they would remove that retention label and then hit delete again, and the file would indeed go through the standard deletion process because of, it would be legitimately deleted that way. A change that's been introduced by Microsoft in August this year actually means that that error message will no longer appear. What this means is when you hit delete on an item that's subject to a retention label in SharePoint, it will be caught and held behind the scenes. So it's now a consistent approach to the way that items are retained in what we call the preservation hold library in Microsoft. Now, I don't know if any of you happen to be on the JISC records management group, but there's an email group, for those who aren't, that shares information around changes in records management. But only a couple of days ago now, the information came out that someone has spotted it in their message center in their tenancy. I just would like to thank actually Fife Council for that. It was Mike Pierce up in Fife who spotted it before I got to it. But effectively, the ability to, coming very soon in November, Microsoft are providing the ability to start deleting things from that preservation hold library behind the scenes, this hidden SharePoint space where content is caught. And this would mean that scenarios such as, imagine you have deleted a file because you legitimately want to delete it, perhaps it contains PII, it would be caught behind the scenes in this preservation hold library. You now have the ability for the first time coming in November to be able to go to that library behind the scenes and force the item to actually be deleted if you legitimately do want it deleted. That's quite a good introduction that's coming over the next few weeks. Now, at the end of retention, with a retention policy, as we've already seen, there's 2 options, deletion or do nothing. With a retention label, there's 3 options. You've got also the ability to invoke a disposition review. So at the end of the retention period, you can actually take a look at the item, review whether or not you want to dispose of it or whether you're happy to to keep it within the organization. You can also extend the length of retention at that point. There will be, I hope, forthcoming future options in that space as well. So watch this area. I'm fairly confident we'll see some other improvements coming here fairly soon. Now, the items that I've just labeled in green there, default labels, automated, event-based, mutability, and disposition review, all of those I just wanted to highlight simply because those are all capabilities that require a more premium license. And by premium, I'm talking about upgrading to what you'd call an E5 license or one of the interim steps. There's some compliance sort of bolt-ons to E3 that would enable these capabilities. Now, another key difference between retention labels and retention policies is the breadth that they can go to. So there's different parts of the tenancy you can apply retention labels to. And as you can probably see from this little diagram here, retention policies are actually have a much wider scope than retention labels. So while I'm a big fan of the retention label, I think it's the primary way of managing records in Microsoft 365, the retention policy is certainly not something to overlook. It has a much wider coverage. And certainly when you're talking about, for example, channel messages, private channel messages, chats, etc., the retention policy is the only way of undertaking any form of records management at the moment inside Microsoft 365. So personally, I think the best approach is a composite of both. You use retention labels where it's most appropriate to do so, and you use retention policies in other spaces. And in some spaces, for example, OneDrive, you might consider using both. Right, I'll just dive in very quickly, take a look at adaptive scopes. Adaptive scopes is a recent change that's been introduced by Microsoft. Effectively, adaptive scope, when I say recent, it's only a few weeks old now. So Microsoft first announced it back in May, and effectively it was, I believe, only a few weeks ago, it was 3 weeks that we actually saw it starting to roll out across people's tenancies. Now, I think adaptive scopes are really powerful and interesting because they take us forwards in terms of our ability to make use of both retention labels and also retention policies. So let's go back and let's just focus back on this retention policy example I had earlier. We had different retention applied at a broad brush approach. But bear in mind, the adaptive scope will work across both retention policies and retention labels. I'm just using this as an example. The idea here is that, let's simplify this. Let's just zoom in on one person. We have the financial retention policy applied to all of the emails in Lara's inbox. Now, in order to single out Lara, so that this retention policy is applied just to Lara and not to Nadia or Ben or any other colleagues in the organization, effectively, she needs to be singled out and her email address needs to be associated with that retention policy. She needs, as a user, to be singled out centrally. And that, as you can imagine, is quite a challenge in a large organization to pick all of the people that you need a different retention policy for. But this is where the adaptive scope steps in. So, of course, in Microsoft 365, we know an awful lot more about Lara than just her name. What we've also got is a whole range of other attributes being stored about her. So being surfaced in your in Azure AD, there's a whole bunch of user properties. Now, I know what you're thinking. Everyone's Azure AD needs a bit of a spring clean, but most organizations seem to have Office and Department fairly reliably stored. And honestly, if you're one of those organizations that thinks you need a bit of a spring clean, and every time you get a consultant in over the last 10 years, they've said, you should probably tidy up your AD, I really would recommend it again. Sorry to be sort of repeating the same message, but having a tidy AD is really quite useful wherever you possibly can. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this is obviously when we're looking at Lara, we know she's in the Swindon office. We probably know the name of her line manager. We know that she's in the payroll team. And specifically, we can use this information to apply a retention policy or selection of retention labels if we wish to. So specifically what the adaptive scope of that is going to allow us to do is we can start defining rules for the application of the retention policy or the group of retention labels. But in this case, what we've done here is I've created an adaptive scope that will apply the retention policy only in the scenario where the user's department is equal to payroll. Okay. So what this is going to do is it's going to find all of the users who happen to be in the payroll department and automatically apply the same adaptive scope to them. This means I don't have to name Lara individually. But more interestingly, and I think more importantly, it means that it accommodates change in the organization. So effectively, you can almost look at the adaptive scope as a real dynamic sort of way of applying retention. So let's give you an example. See Ben here. Imagine Ben's in the legal team and he, changes role. It's what happens in real organizations. He leaves legal and he joins payroll. You can probably imagine that because we've not associated this retention policy specifically to an individual, as people move through the organization, if their department is updated, we can apply this on an office or any other attribute you want, you can imagine it's automatically going to change the retention policy or the retention labels that are applied or available to that user. And there's a whole bunch of other attributes that we've got available to that user. So as I've been alluding to, there's things like the job title. So you could, for example, all of the scientists in your organization, you could potentially apply different retention to their content that you would apply to other users. And interesting, the custom attribute, if you happen to be applying custom metadata, you've got quite a lot of flexibility here over precisely who gets which retention applied to them. And up till now, I've only been talking about the concept of emails. So, just looking specifically at Lara's inbox before. But of course, it's not just email in Microsoft 365. There's a whole bunch of other parts of Microsoft 365 that revolve around the individual. So we're looking at OneDrive accounts, we're looking at the user messages that are sent in Yammer, for example. Of course, one-to-one private Teams chats and, very importantly, private channel messages as well. All of these, in theory, you can apply adaptive scopes to apply the retention policy based upon the user attribute. But of course, it's not just users who have attributes. The sites that are provided in SharePoint and OneDrive and also underpin Microsoft Teams, the sites behind Microsoft Teams, all of the files that are stored in those sites have other properties we can get our hands on. The URL of the site name, and importantly, the site property bag, which for those of you who have never come across a site property bag, imagine this as hidden flexible metadata that can be applied to each site. So you can almost tag your site, not the content in them, you're tagging the sites themselves with hidden metadata that no one gets to see. But you can use these attributes to automatically apply and extend retention using adaptive scopes to SharePoint sites and OneDrive. And of course, there's the Microsoft 365 group model as well. So in the Microsoft 365 group, you've got a whole bunch of other attributes from the group names, the group alias, that you can make use of to extend over the Microsoft 365 groups, channel messages, and of course, Yammer community messages as well. So just leave this on the screen for a split second in case anyone wants to take a screenshot, but effectively, adaptive scopes provide you with significant flexibility to dynamically extend retention across Microsoft 365. I think this is a big step forward, so in the retention capabilities that is only just landing on our door right now. Right, hope everyone got the screenshots in if they wanted that one, but wanted to move on quickly and just think about the actual reality then of how you wire this together, because most certainly local government organizations I've ever been in, it's a big complicated organization with lots of people with different remits and different responsibilities. And as you can imagine, something like an adaptive scope I think is going to be very powerful. It's helping you to dynamically apply retention, but it's certainly, I think for most of you, you'll be looking at other constructs of applying retention to different parts of your content. Now, the most traditional way that people approach this, certainly going back since the early days of SharePoint, is to build out static structures. And I'm sure most of you actually on this call have probably in the past experienced legacy SharePoint sites that perhaps 10 years ago, 15 years ago were built out with a static structure of sites, site collections, etc., containing libraries and folders, which had different classification set as defaults throughout them, different content types, different metadata built in and baked into that model of hierarchical sites. Now, of course, this is still there. We can still build this hierarchy of sites and, workspaces. Let's call them workspaces. I prefer that term because it sort of encompasses both SharePoint sites and, of course, Microsoft Teams as well. But really, when you're thinking about this now, the architecture has changed across Microsoft 365 quite a bit over the last decade. We no longer talk about web applications, and we no longer talk about subsites. They're still there, subsites, but we don't use them. It's bad practice. Instead, we're using hubs, and we're using sites all in the modern UI within SharePoint. And you build out a structure that's typically wider and less deep than previously, but you can still build that structure. You can still set default metadata and default content types. And importantly, when you're building out that structure, you can still apply default retention as we've seen. And you can also extend this into other concepts like sensitivity. You can certainly apply sensitivity labels, which I'm not going to go into in this conversation in any depth, but sensitivity labels can be applied certainly at the container level on the site, let's say, to provide extra security over your content, extra protection over what you're doing there. Happy to go into sensitivity labels later if anyone's interested. But that's not the only way of working in Microsoft 365, and I'm sure people from Microsoft would agree that almost that legacy approach of having a big static structure isn't always the best way of working. So it's still a legitimate choice in some scenarios, certainly when the content is more focused upon the storage of content than it is upon collaboration. But as you can imagine, much of Microsoft 365 is now a highly collaborative environment. It's all about getting people together to work together. And anyone who's made use of Microsoft Teams can tell you that people jump into them and make Microsoft Teams and will spin up lots of different workspaces all over the place to get their work done with different groups of people. So imagine with Teams or SharePoint, what you really need to do is, before those workspaces are created, you need to control that process to apply retention to them. So you really need to introduce processes so that people can request new workspaces. Maybe there's some approval at that stage, maybe you don't want approval. But importantly, before the workspace is created, what you almost need is to choose how it's going to be created, what shape it's going to take. You need a process. This could be fully manual, someone sat there receiving an email, building out the exact configuration of that workspace, or it could be fully automated. So a consistent sort of process behind the scenes that's stamping out every workspace that you create the way that you need it to be configured. And that's the important part here, is that this workspace provisioning, whether manual or automated, is taking your configuration, your metadata, your security settings, your retention, and it's applying that to the workspace. Perhaps it's setting up, let's say this is a team, perhaps it's setting up a starting series of channels and automatically, setting a separate retention label on each of those channels before you give the workspace back to the user. So the outcome is that you're giving each member of staff a fairly consistent workspace, whether a team, whether a SharePoint site, that's pre-configured for with baked-in retention and baked-in compliance to help you sort of fulfill what you're trying to achieve. And honestly, in many organizations, a combination of both the sort of static structure that we saw on the previous slide and also this provisioning process really are often used in harmony with each other, if you like, as two compatible different approaches to making sure that you're extending the retention capabilities out to the relevant workspaces. So I've talked for long enough. I'll wrap up there. I'm happy to take any questions from any of you. If I've not been looking, has anyone actually asked any questions yet? There's a few.
Yeah, I do see quite a few questions there, Rob, for you. Do you mind me just reading them out for you, starting at the top?
Yeah, please do. Go for it, Margarita. I'll try and answer everyone's questions, so feel free to keep adding them to the list if you want to.
So, what are the crucial elements to get right for designing, delivering, and maintaining a successful records management system?
Gosh, that's a huge question. There's lots to think about. Effectively, I think you fundamentally need to think about where you are storing your records. Which parts of Microsoft 365 are going to be almost systems for storing records in. So some, I think Microsoft, their design intention here is that records management is going to be, in situ across different workloads across the tenancy. And certainly, I think that's a good approach to start considering, storing records in situ across different parts of the tenant. But as you can probably imagine, some organizations still want to almost have a central hub, a central space where they move records into from different parts of the tenant. But this isn't the only consideration. I think concepts like what is a team in terms of Microsoft Teams? Is it for any form of collaboration, or is it temporary storage, for temporary collaboration like a project? In which case, what happens at the end of a Teams lifecycle? Do you have a closure process, and do you move the records elsewhere? Obviously, I think you need to almost approach records management in Microsoft 365 holistically. You need to look at the whole tenancy and think about what people are trying to achieve, what workloads you've got available to you, and quite where the records are going to store and how you're going to move them through the system. And that is quite complicated. You fundamentally, as records managers, I think, need to be heavily involved in the entire architectural decisions that are made around the tenancy. Hope that sort of answered that. I could carry on talking for another 4 or 5 hours on that one.
Right, moving on. What are the main difference between SharePoint on-premise that have retention using a third-party tool and retention in Office?
Gosh, okay, so obviously SharePoint on-premise has different ways of managing records. You've got some legacy approaches called record centers and in-place records management that are available since about SharePoint 2010. I think record centers came out. SharePoint 2013, I think, was when we got in-place records management. These approaches, certainly in Microsoft 365, have now been superseded by retention labels and retention policies. So in the context of Microsoft 365, I would never recommend looking back at those old legacy approaches. But obviously, you're talking about a bespoke third-party tool. There's various different third-party tools out there on the market, as I'm sure you're aware. I'm not going to name any of them, but we're all aware of who owns these tools and who builds them. These different tools all have their pros and cons. Compared to the legacy on-premise records management capabilities, I think these tools have quite a bit of sort of benefit. But certainly compared to the more recent retention capabilities in Microsoft 365, what I'd suggest is that these tools are, Microsoft has closed the gap considerably. There's very little area really where these tools have much benefit now over what you're getting in Microsoft 365. I'll caveat specifically, typically the one area where they have an advantage is around the concept of aggregation, because Microsoft treats every item as an individual item to review, whereas these third-party tools very often have a concept of aggregation which allows you to review multiple items as a single collective. Now that is a big, important thing. That said, Microsoft is slowly eroding all of these gaps, and I think in a couple of years' time there won't be much of a delta at all. So it's really, I would personally, if I were making a decision, lean more towards using the out-of-the-box capabilities provided in Microsoft 365 over and above looking at third-party tools. But it's not going to be always that solution in every scenario. Different authorities will make different decisions depending on their needs.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. I think that covers the question.
I hope so.
Next one, I think we do have time for a few more. How to manage permanent archives, which will be transferred to the national archives, and keep destruction evidence in Microsoft 365.
Okay, so obviously the transfer of content into TNA, or if you're in Northern Ireland, PRONI, or any of the other bodies, is an important part of this story. Now, you'll notice that the what you almost need to do is there isn't part of the end of retention that is transfer. So I'm hoping that this is something that can be built or extended in the future. I'm keeping my fingers crossed in this area. But effectively, what you need to do is at the end of retention, you need to build in a process that allows you to identify the files during review that you want to actually transfer. You'll very often need to undertake, additional sensitivity reviews, etc., to make sure that they're valid. I'll be honest, I think it's an area that needs tightening up, that needs slightly improving, and that it's not consistently sort of defined or applied. But that said, don't worry, I'm working on it. So it's something that I think almost you need to consider separately as each organization. Was there another part to that question? Sorry, that I didn't answer, Margarita. Am I reading it again, just in case I missed something?
Sure. How to manage permanent archives, which will be transferred to the national archives, and keep destruction evidence in Microsoft 365.
It was the destruction evidence side of things, and also the permanent archive, coming to think of it. So, okay, Microsoft 365 is not an archival tool. That said, its retention capabilities can both be used for records management and also bent into archival if you want to. So effectively, you've got an ability to do a bit of archival in situ in Microsoft 365. In terms of evidence, effectively, what you've got is you've got Microsoft 365's audit information, which is only preserved for a certain amount of time. But if you configure that audit information, you can apply retention policies effectively to the audit to preserve the audit up to 10 years into the future. Now, I recognize that that will be good in some scenarios, and perhaps you'll need to preserve evidence of destruction for longer in other scenarios, but that's having it, it's been increased significantly up to 10 years over recent months. I think it was only this time last year, I think it was something like 6 or 9 months. I can't remember off the top of my head, but having it now as the ability to retain that for up to 10 years is something that I think is a big step forwards. And certainly through the IRMS, through our CAB relationship, which is a customer advisory board, we are trying to work with Microsoft on things such as enhancing how long we can keep the proof of destruction for, and also enhancing the metadata the flexibility around the metadata that we can actually ensure that is retained for that duration. So record-based metadata as opposed to metadata that's applied to the living content. Let's move on to the next one. I hope that's a good answer.
I think that covers the question, yes. Just looking at the time, we have 8 minutes left, so that's maybe just enough time to cover what questions we have got in so far.
Cool.
So next one, when you merge two M365 tenants and create a new labeling strategy, what is the impact on documents with existing labels and policies?
Okay, so that's a question and a half. Firstly, merging two Microsoft 365 tenancies is a very complicated process. It's much more complicated to take two tenancies and merge them into one than it is to move into Microsoft 365 in the first place. And the easiest way I can explain that is typically when you're moving into Microsoft 365, you're thinking exclusively about emails, you're thinking about files in a file store. But once you're in Microsoft 365, suddenly you're talking about Sway and Stream and Teams and Chat. You've got to think about all of these different sources to merge. So as you can imagine, there's going to be different retention potentially applied to different parts of that content. And there's lots to think about. This is the simple way of answering this. Effectively, you're probably going to have to think about, certainly if there's retention in both the two tenancies you're moving from, you're going to have to assess them and work out what your future retention model looks like. You're also going to want to make sure that you preserve as best as you can the retention as you migrate across. So, you know, if it's important that something is, say, 3 years through a 7-year period, that when it moves into the future tenant, you want to preserve that retention wherever you can. And of course, that would mean ideally setting up similar retention labels so that you can migrate into the future state and retain the retention. It's not always going to be as easy as I'm making it sound. Effectively, any migration is very complicated, but specifically a migration between tenancies, I think, needs a lot of upfront planning. Again, the only real answer to that is spending a lot of time speaking to an organization who's going through that and helping them plan months in advance. And as you can probably imagine, in a migration scenario, there's going to be lots going on behind the scenes that also requires other focuses of time, etc.
Of course. 2 more? Is that okay with you, Rob?
Yes, keep going.
Will automatic deleting of contents be seen as an improved method by the archives? Will it satisfy legislative requirements? That's a question that was submitted just now.
So I'm not going to claim to represent TNA here or any of the other archival bodies like PRONI. You know, very much I can't answer on their behalf, and I'm also not a lawyer, so I don't have a legal background. But I personally feel that most of these archival bodies are recommending best endeavors, and that you use the technology that you've got at your disposal to the best effect that you can within the bounds that you've got of the constraints of your license and your ability to actually configure the environment. So personally, I think certainly as long as you're keeping for the more important information, evidence of destruction, as we mentioned before in the retention applied to the audit logs, I would suggest that it will be considered legitimate proof of destruction by most archival bodies. Caveat that slightly, as Microsoft improves its capabilities, I think we all need to keep an eye to the ground and keep tweaking and changing whatever we're doing to make sure that we keep up with what the technology offers. Because, of course, if we set something up and don't adapt it to take advantage of whatever the technology gives us in the future, it could mean that we're not really utilizing all the technology at our disposal and therefore might be over time considered to be less compliant. But I'm on dodgy ice answering that sort of question, but I'll try my best.
All good, Rob. One more. Can you do hybrid records management in Microsoft 365 information management?
I'm assuming you mean hybrid with an on-premise tenant. It's something I've never been asked before, and it's something I've never really thought about too much. So I'm not entirely sure. What you can do, you've got the ability to extend retention slightly further, because you can almost apply retention to other sources. Typically, what this means is you're almost copying content into Microsoft 365 so you can apply retention to it. Because of course, if you think about it, the other environments typically can't support the retention label. So retention labels aren't supported in SharePoint on-premise. They're not supported in file shares. They're not supported in third-party tools, etc. So it's not very easy to extend it out of the bounds of the tenant. Typically, the hybrid scenario, you need to move your content into Microsoft 365 before you can really take advantage of the new retention capabilities. And that, for example, is a good reason potentially, if you are in a hybrid scenario, to maybe look more seriously at a third-party tool, or maybe look at some of the legacy approaches that are available on-premise for the content that's still on-premise.
Robbie did actually added physical and digital records.
Physical as well. Well, obviously physical is a whole separate conversation, because when it comes to physical records, really what you're looking to do is make sure that you've got some reference, some link through to the physical records. What I've tended to do in the past is look at SharePoint lists as a good solution for managing physical records, because what you can do is almost store the barcode or the reference and apply retention to almost a list item, so that when the item itself that's almost a list item comes up for the end of retention, you then have the ability to trigger a process that would allow you to say, find a box in an archive that matches the same ID. Obviously, Microsoft can't automatically delete that box down for you, but it can trigger the process that starts the deletion of that box, or moving that box to archive, for example.
Thank you, Rob. I just see one more came in. We have 2 minutes left. Maybe we can just quickly do that one as well.
Of course, keep going.
Sure. What should we look for in records management solutions? How far does Microsoft 365 cover this?
Well, that's a very broad question. What should we be looking for in records management solutions? Well, it really depends on you as an organization and what your compliance needs are. In the context of local government, I think most local government organizations really need to take advantage of the capabilities that are being provided to them in Microsoft 365, assuming they're in Microsoft 365, and use them to the fullest extent that they can within the constraints of licensing, etc. So what should you be looking for? Well, for some organizations, it's really going to be sort of acceptable to use almost a flat approach of retention policies applied broadly across content, because actually that might be sufficient based upon the specific regulatory needs on that type of organization. I think in local government, you really need to be looking to take wide advantage of some of the more advanced capabilities if you've got access to them, because honestly, I think there is actually legislative need to manage content as a record. We really, what you don't want is someone suing you or a fine from the ICO. So, we're all aware of the risk. I think it's important to evaluate this individually. And I wouldn't say there's a single one-size-fits-all rule, and that's part of why it's so complicated in the retention story in Microsoft 365. What looks like good in one organization really isn't good or acceptable in another.
Thank you, Rob. That was brilliant. I think we actually covered all the questions now. We do need to wrap up now, just on time. So I would just like to say a big thank you to Rob for his presentation, and I hope you all enjoyed the session. As I mentioned in the beginning, the recording will be available on our website and YouTube channel by the end of this week. Could you just move one more slide, Rob? In case anyone is interested to see Rob in action, he has been nominated as a speaker for the South Coast Summit this Saturday. So this is a free cloud technology conference focusing on the Microsoft stack, to be held in person this year. So anybody is just welcome to just tag along. That's it for me. Thank you again, Rob. Thank you for everyone who's joined us today, and have a lovely afternoon.
Cheers all.